The Constitution begins with the words, "We the people." But the people who wrote it didn't have in mind people like me. The prosperity of this new nation depended on chattel slavery. Most of my family comes from the Caribbean island of Trinidad. When the British conquered the island from the Spanish in 1797, it had 18,000 people on it. 10,000 of those people were enslaved Africans who toiled on sugar plantations under unspeakable conditions. When the Constitution was ratified, about 1 in 5 Americans were enslaved people of African descent. Of the 55 men at the Constitutional Convention, half were enslavers. The new federal government had limited powers at first, but one was the power to apprehend enslaved people who had escaped and return them to the enslavers. The Constitution also counted slaves as 3/5 of a person to give slave states more representation in Congress, even though enslaved people had 0/5 of the rights promised to white citizens. The Constitution was written by and for enslavers. They were terrified that the people that they enslaved might escape or rebel. But they were also afraid of poor white people. Immediately after the Revolutionary War, the United States was racked by uprisings of poor white folks who had risked life and limb to fight the British, only to see their debts mount and creditors seize their lands. James Madison, the Constitution's mastermind, concluded that the Constitution needed to prevent the poor from gaining power. The great counter-majoritarian institution that Madison devised was the US Senate, which in his own words was meant to, and I quote, protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. Senators were chosen by their state legislatures, not voters, until the early 20th century. Many states only allowed their wealthiest citizens to serve in the Senate. Fast forward to today, the Senate has become an instrument of minority rule in a new way. In 1790, the most populous state, Virginia, 13 times as many people as the least populous state. Today, California, with almost 40 million people, has 69 times as many inhabitants as Wyoming, with fewer than 600,000 people. The US Senate today gives vastly disproportionate representation to rural, predominantly white states. This creates a Republican advantage. The 54 senators who voted for Neil Gorsuch's confirmation represented only 45% of the population. Speaking of the Senate's power over judicial nominees, Mitch McConnell and the Republicans blocked the confirmation of a Supreme Court justice nominated by Barack Obama, and then rammed through confirmations for far-right judge Neil Gorsuch and the far-right alleged sexual assaulter Brett Kavanaugh. In fact, 4 of the 5 right-wing justices on the Supreme Court were nominated by Republican presidents, Bush and Trump, who were elected despite losing the popular vote, but won the electoral vote. Yet another counter-majoritarian relic of the Constitution. Now, the most right-wing Supreme Court in a century is ready to accelerate the rollback of women's rights, LGBT rights, voting rights, labor rights, environmental regulations, campaign finance rules, every issue that gives power and autonomy to anyone outside a small group of wealthy white men. Based on what we know of our nation's origins, you can see how that might happen. The presidential race takes up a lot of oxygen with good reason. But it seems to me that we might not be spending enough time thinking about the US Senate. To take the majority away from Republicans, we must defend a difficult seat in Alabama, beat incumbent Republicans in places like Colorado, North Carolina, and Arizona, and possibly win an open seat in Georgia. Even if we win, Democrats may be so scared of losing that they might resist much of the transformative agenda that our next president could bring to Washington. So what is the unique role of the Working Families Party and our allies in this situation? First of all, any hope of victory on our issues requires ending Republican control of the Senate. That means supporting Democratic nominees in competitive states, even if, as seems likely, some of those nominees don't share many of our convictions. Whatever we do, we have to work on behalf of Senate candidates. However, we'll work to build durable infrastructure to help shift those states' politics in our direction over the long term. So there's the short-term intervention, but then there's a long-term change that we have to do, knowing that some of these folks don't line up with our values. Just as importantly, however, WFP has a role to play in ensuring that Democrats who represent more democratic states are champions for the multiracial working class. We know that at present, this is far from the case. Many Senate Democrats are either enthusiastic fundraisers from Wall Street and Silicon Valley, and they have rewarded those industries with lax regulation. So we could do much, much, much better. And we have to do a whole lot better if you want to shift from defense to offense. If you want to enact transformative changes like Medicare for All, a Green New Deal, free college, and more, we have to demand better. That's why WFP is thrilled to support Maggie Toulouse-Oliver for the open US Senate seat in New Mexico. Maggie has been a strong progressive Secretary of State, helping to champion dramatic expansions of voter rights in New Mexico. She's running against former DCCC leader Ben Ray Lujan in the Democratic primary. We couldn't be more proud to stand with Maggie. She's the kind of working families champion we don't have enough of in the US Senate. And you'll hear from her directly right after this message. And I'm so honored tonight to introduce Maggie, who, if she's elected, will be truly our first working families Democrat in the US Senate. She's running again on a platform of equal pay, a Green New Deal, and strengthening voting rights. And she's a model for the kind of progressive champions we need in the Senate. Maggie, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to get right to it and just ask a question.
Great.
Okay, let's get into it. All right. So New Mexico has never in its history elected a woman to the US Senate. Why do you think the time is right for that finally to happen, and what does it mean?
First of all, Mo, thank you so much for all of your amazing words just now. And thanks all of you for having me on the call. And I just want to give a shout out to Chelsea and Rachel. You guys are amazing. Keep it up. I'm really inspired by both of you. So thank you. So to answer your question, Mo, the time is well past, right? This nation is in its 243rd year. I know that because I was born in the bicentennial in 1976. And, you know, New Mexico has been a state since 1912. And while we've done a lot of progressive work over the years, sending great voices from New Mexico, in fact, we were the first state to send a Latino to the United States Senate. At the end of the day, we've never sent a woman, and it is well past time. And especially this year, in light of the war on women and women's reproductive rights that has been happening since the inception of the Trump administration, it's more important than ever.
Great, thank you. That's really helpful. And I couldn't agree more. I have a few more questions for you while we have you, Maggie. Your campaign is the only one in New Mexico this cycle to unionize.
Yeah.
It's important to you that your campaign staff have union representation, and what role do you see unions playing in the economy overall?
So I think right now in this country, one of the things that is bringing previously unengaged folks to the table is the greater realization that we are all having that economic inequality is one of the biggest issues of our time, and it is one of the biggest problems that we need to overcome as a society. And in my view, the work that's been done over the last 30 plus years to really decimate our labor unions in this country has contributed to that significantly. When people feel free to come together in their workplace and to organize and to collectively bargain for pay, for working conditions, for benefits, then that gives us collectively as a greater society the ability to continue to grow and support the working class and the middle class of our society. Instead, there has been an absolute attack on unions and labor and working people, particularly over the last 30 years, especially with the emergence of so-called right-to-work states, the ability for governments at all levels to really wage an attack on the ability of people to come together and collectively bargain. So because I hold those values and because I believe so strongly in the need to strengthen unions in this country, I felt like it was important to live those values and to walk the walk on those values within the context of my own campaign for Senate. I also worked on campaigns for 13 years before I became an elected official. And I knew that it it was really hard for me personally to work so many hours, to not have the ability to take time off, paid time off, to not have health insurance or sick leave, or any of the opportunities that we can provide through a union shop to my employees now. I lived the experience of not having those opportunities myself. And so again, it's really important for me when I see a problem and when I want to represent the issue authentically, to be walking the walk on that issue.
Great, thanks. And thank you so much for walking the walk. It's, you know, from our perspective, without reinvigorating organized labor, there's no way that we could achieve all the goals that we want for our society. Working together to lead and organize. So another question for you, we have two more. The Senate is one of the least democratic institutions in our democracy. How will you work as a U.S. Senator to ensure that the Senate represents working people?
And I think that in your sermon, you really kind of talked about that. And I think it's really important for us to recognize that so much of the potential good public policy that's waiting in the wings right now, that the House has passed, is literally sitting and waiting to die in the U.S. Senate right now. The U.S. Senate has become a total rubber stamp for the Trump administration. It has become a pass-through for everything bad that Donald Trump can think of, and it has become a complete full stop for any good policy that could potentially come through. And this is a huge problem, and it's a problem because right now we have a quite frankly, Republicans who are a minority in this country in leadership in the Senate, and they led by Mitch McConnell, are making all of the decisions. They have completely eradicated so many Senate rules and norms over the years that existed to protect the minority party in the Senate. We can't even get issues called up for a vote or even a debate on the Senate floor to be discussed. The filibuster has been completely turned into something unrecognizable, right? In the past, if you wanted to prevent an issue for coming up for a vote, or if you wanted to make sure that you put a stop to something, then what you would do is you would stand on the Senate floor and you would hold the floor for as long as it took. And if that meant that you had to finally get off your topic and start reading sections of the Bible or cookbooks or what have you to hold the floor, you did that. Nowadays, you can be basking in the sun at Trump's resort in Florida and simply place a phone call or send a text and say, I'm placing a hold on this vote. I'm intending to conduct a filibuster, and that brings it to a screeching halt. This is incredibly undemocratic. It's not what our founders envisioned. So it really takes electing people to the Senate who understand how fundamentally undemocratic it has become and who are willing to shake things up and use their voice, and not only use their voice, but take our voice to the people and begin demanding that the Senate become accountable to us, that the Senate begin to call up for a vote and call up for debate and discussion so many of these important issues that are really just lingering, whether it be immigration reform, the Equality Act, H.R. 1, the For the People Act, which would create countrywide standards for allowing ballot access and equality in regard to the voting environment. These are all really important things that are never going to see the light of day under the current leadership in the Senate. And unless people are really, really willing to stand up and call that out and do it in a way that reaches the people and holds these people accountable, we are never going to see change.
Great, thank you so much. Couldn't agree with you more again. I mean, that's why I endorsed you, because we're so deeply aligned. I'm
incredibly honored.
For sure. And so we just, Maggie, we have one last question. And we want to thank you so much for taking the time from the campaign to join us. And we ask all of our guests this question: will you join today officially as a paid member of the Working Families Party?
Yes. Wait a minute, what are the dues? Just kidding. No, no, I'd be proud to, and it would be my honor. I so believe in the values and the work of the Working Families Party. I am so honored to have been endorsed, and it would make me so happy to officially be a member of the Working Families Party.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Maggie. I can't thank you enough for joining us tonight. And if you'd like to support Maggie's campaign, you could contribute to her and our other candidates on the call by going to wfpus.org/donate1027. That's wfpus.org/donate1027. If you're using the app, you'll see the link in your chat box. And I just want to thank all three candidates. I think it's a part of our special sauce that we focus on every level of government, and we build a pipeline of progressive leaders that will transform our country. So I just want to thank all of you.